We're set to borrow nearly $1 trillion this year. Our overall debt is over $22 trillion. In my office, I have a debt clock. You can see it at debtclock.org, and it's spinning out of control. The numbers are mind-boggling. Interest is set in the next decade, just the interest on the debt, to exceed $1 trillion. That's $1 trillion simply wasted because we're not fiscally responsible enough to balance our budget. There are ramifications to having so much debt. When we monetize the debt or the Federal Reserve creates money to pay for the debt, what ends up happening is it dilutes the value of your current dollars. Over time, we've been doing that for a long period of nearly 100 years or over 100 years since the Federal Reserve was created, and the vast majority of the dollar's value has been lost over time. Now, inflation is not what it used to be, but there still are other problems. As interest grows in the debt, it crowds out other spending. So when we get to spending $1 trillion on the interest of the debt, what it's going to do is it's going to crowd out other spending. Whether you're on the right and you want more military spending, you're on the left, you want more welfare spending, it's being crowded out by the debt growing so much that interest is pushing out other projects. What I've offered is, I think, a common sense approach to this. Everybody's got their sacred cow. Everybody's got some money they want to spend somewhere. Why don't we cut every program by 2 pennies? We have a 2% across-the-board cut, and so what we do is we'd spend 98% of what we spent last year. And it's interesting, when groups come in to see me in the office and they say, well, we've got this dramatic program and it's to cure AIDS or Alzheimer's or diabetes, and it's going to be this wonderful project. And I say, well, last year you got $100 million. Could you deal with $98 million this year? And interestingly, whether they're conservative, liberal, or independent, they look at me and say, well, gosh, yeah, I think I could deal with $98 million instead of $100. I think we could deal with a 2% cut. We get 98% of what we got last year. And most of the groups that are actually invested in this have a family member with one of these diseases, think they could deal with it. You know who the only people in the whole country who think we couldn't do it? The people you've elected. They've become so distant from you that they won't vote for any cuts. They think, oh, woe is me, it'd be so much money. The media will say that even a freeze in spending for 10 years is a $10 trillion cut. How could that possibly be? If we spend the same amount of money next year as we spent this year, how could that be a cut? But the media controls the narrative. The left has aided and abetted them, and they say, well, we were going to spend 5% more, so you cut 5% by not increasing the spending from last year. That's ridiculous. So they call a freeze a spending cut. If your salary is going to be the same next year as it was last year, is that a cut, or are you getting the same salary? So what I'm proposing is we cut it by 2%. Why 2? Well, we would like to balance the budget, ultimately. This is just the annual budget. It isn't getting rid of the debt, not the $22 trillion debt. It's just so we quit digging the hole deeper. For the first several years, I proposed this, and we called it the penny plan. We would cut 1% a year for 5 years, and the budget would balance in 5 years. But nobody listened. Not one Democrat cares at all about the debt. Not one of them will ever vote to cut any spending. Now, on the Republican side, they profess to care, but over half of them won't vote to cut any spending. So there's a lot of hypocrisy to go around. But when I first started introducing the penny plan, a 1% cut would have balanced the budget in 5 years. But since we didn't do it, government spending kept exploding and growing, so now it takes a 2% cut. This would be a 2% cut of everything but Social Security. The problem is, though, nobody's introduced a bill in decades, or nobody's had a vote in decades on a bill to fix the real problem, which is entitlements. So many of the people will bemoan, oh, we could never fix it by cutting discretionary spending, so I'm not going to cut any. But that's the only thing we ever get to vote on, so that's what we're putting forward, a 2% cut. Still, in order to balance it, you would have to have a 2% cut of the entitlements as well. But we might as well start with what we're doing. And some people say, well, government is so essential. We would cut government, and what would happen to the people who depend on it? Well, let me give you an example of some of what your government's spending your money on. The National Science Foundation probably gets the award for some of the most ridiculous spending in all of your government. Even since the times of William Proxmire in the early 1970s, they would get the Golden Fleece Award. One of his first awards gave them an award for spending $50,000 to determine what makes you happy. It was thought to be ridiculous at the time, and then for the last 50 years, we've continued to do it. In fact, just this last year, the National Science Foundation is still concerned about what makes you happy. So they spent $500,000 this time. I guess that's inflation. They spent $500,000 studying whether or not if you take a selfie of yourself while smiling, whether or not that makes you happy. And if you'll keep looking at the picture of yourself smiling, the selfie you took, is that worth $500,000? Do we not have something better we could do? Maybe we could reduce the deficit by cutting the National Science Foundation. They also studied what Neil Armstrong said when he landed on the moon. Did he say, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, or did he say one small step for a man? They spent $700,000 of your money studying whether or not Neil Armstrong said a man or man. And guess what the experts said after they listened to the tape? Crackle, 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 over and over again. For $700,000, they don't know. Experts still disagree. Did he say a man or just man? $700,000. We spent $1.2 million studying online dating. Look, they seem to be successful. I think it must be working. The websites are making a ton of money. Millions of people use them. Why in the world would government study whether dating sites work? They spent $1.5 million trying to make tomatoes taste better. I don't know where that came from. They funded a book on appreciating the metric system for $188,000. There was a conference sponsored on balding for $22,000. Department of Commerce got into the game. They developed a digital downs marker for football games for $130,000. I think that's existed already. They spent $500,000 on a movie about the kilogram. Raise your hand if you're going to stay up tonight to watch the Department of Commerce documentary on the kilogram. Department of Agriculture provides marketing assistance for specialty crops, including Christmas trees. It turns out there are more specialty crops than regular crops. $50,000 was given to the University of Georgia, to the state of Georgia, for marketing Christmas trees. The Department of Interior studied people's experiences with sea monsters in Alaska, $150,000. Now, I thought sea monsters were fake news, but I guess in an era of fake news, it's difficult to determine what is really fake news. But your government spent $150,000 studying sea monsters in Alaska. They built a parking lot at an Indian casino for $500,000. These casinos apparently make multiple millions of dollars a year, and we spent $500,000 paving a parking lot for a for-profit enterprise. We built a self-cleaning toilet in a New York park, city park. We gave $1 million to subsidize Lyft rides. I thought Uber and Lyft were doing quite well without our help. Gave $153 million to D.C. Metro, which apparently is one of the most mismanaged metros in the country. Let's see. National Endowment for the Arts, we spent $25,000 on a museum to Hollywood. If there's any person in the country who really does not need any more adoration and the taxpayers to pay for adoration, it's Hollywood. But you spent $25,000 building a museum, so I guess they can appreciate themselves even more. In order to combat homelessness in LA, we paid to put on plays. Apparently, if you're homeless, it must make you feel better to watch street performers performing a play in front of you. We also paid to put on dances with cars. Now, while that may sound entertaining, it might be that we might have other things that we might want to spend that money on. But we're told every year we couldn't possibly cut any spending. There's no way we could do it. And I put forward these spending proposals because I ran for office and said we should balance the budget. I actually believed what I ran in. I thought I'd get here, and I thought there would be momentum, and Republicans, they all talked about the debt. See, I don't care. The Democrats are not going to vote for it. No Democrat will vote for a spending cut. Never have, never will. But the Republicans at least tell you they will, and then they don't. So what I'm putting forward today is a 2% cut across the board. They'd get to spend 98% of what they spent last year, and we could be serious about actually bringing our budget into line. I've yet to meet someone at home who doesn't think it's a good idea, and I've yet to meet very many people here who are willing to entertain the idea. There is a disconnect between Washington and the people. If you were to ask the people of any of the states that are represented, at least by the Republican side, and I venture to say by some on the Democrat side, if you were to ask any of the people in those states, do you think we could live with 98% of what we spent last year? I think the people would say we ought to do it. Most businesses or families in our country who have had to deal with less money have often had to deal with a lot less than 98% of their previous salary, and people do. Businesses recover all the time by having to clamp down and watch their costs, but government never does. Government just keeps spending and spending and spending. So my vote on my amendment will come up in the next few minutes, and it'll be at 2% across the board, and I urge the other senators to vote in favor of it. At this time, Mr. President, I call it my amendment 1019 and ask that it be reported by number.